In the quiet folds of a New York evening, a bullet whispered a lie, and a painting, long forgotten, remembered everything. Love turned inward, truth wore perfume, and justice arrived late but unblinking. What begins with a forged signature ends with a silence heavier than guilt itself. As Nero Wolfe raises a glass and lowers his guard just an inch, we're drawn into a mystery where loyalty bruises deeper than betrayal, and murder doesn't always look like murder. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. Settle in, because this mystery begins now. It was 9:15 on a Wednesday morning when the phone rang with the tone I've learned to dislike. One ring too calm, too deliberate, as if the caller already knew what she was going to say and had decided I didn't need to speak at all. I picked it up anyway. "Archie Goodwin," I said, watching Wolfe pour beer over sliced bratwurst like it was an orchid, in distress. "Mr. Goodwin," the voice said, "my name is Claudia Hart. My father has just been pronounced dead." No tremor, no sob, no drama. She might have been notifying the butcher that tomorrow's delivery was cancelled. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, "because you're supposed to," though I had no idea whether she was sad, relieved, or calling from the crime scene. "The police believe it was suicide," she continued. 3 shots. In his study, the door was locked from the inside. "And you don't buy it?" "Number, because I heard 4. That earned a raised eyebrow from me and a side glance from Wolfe, who does not believe in eavesdropping except when I do it for him. "I'd like to come speak with Mr. Wolfe," she said. "I believe your services are still available for cases that lie." By the time I hung up, Wolfe had lowered his fork with the delicacy of a man choosing between indigestion and annoyance. "You have the look of a man interrupted at the exact moment he intended to be," I told him. "Her name's Claudia Hart. Her father just shot himself. Or so the police say." Wolfe grunted. "And what, pray, does she want of me? To animate the corpse and compel a second opinion?" "She says she heard 4 shots. The coroner only found 3 wounds." At that, his eyes moved, which for Wolfe is equivalent to another man jumping out of his chair. "Locked room," I added. "Study sealed from the inside. 3 bullets in the body, revolver on the floor, neat and tidy." Wolfe closed his eyes for a beat longer than a blink. There is no dignity in self-murder, less still in amateur drama. "She doesn't think it was suicide. She's coming here." He sighed. Pfui. I didn't blame him. In his view, the only thing more offensive than a poorly staged death was a living person with an inconvenient truth. But he didn't forbid her visit, which meant, despite himself, his curiosity had stepped into the ring. Wolfe spent the next 10 minutes immersed in silent protest, which for him meant rearranging his cutlery and refusing to speak. I let him simmer while I tapped out a background check on Lemuel Hart, art dealer, widower, known for being precise with his words and brutal with his contracts. The kind of man who probably corrected his daughter's grammar at the breakfast table. "She says it was 4, I reminded Wolfe. "She's not hysterical, just insistent. That's rarer than you'd think." "She is mistaken," Wolfe muttered, not looking up, or attempting to embroider grief with conspiracy. In either case, an affliction for the police. "Still," I said, watching him avoid my eyes with the focus of a man dodging an obligation. "I'd say it's an odd suicide. 3 bullets to get the job done. What kind of man shoots himself 3 times? "One who enjoys redundancy," Wolfe said, "or one who didn't." I had saved the last nugget for dessert, knowing Wolfe's mind needed one final bite to chew on and before it truly got going. I slid the report from the precinct across the desk, watched him glance at it with disdain, then lift a brow as if the paper had insulted his mother. "No powder burns," I said, "on either hand." His eyelid twitched. "Nothing on the cuffs either, not even a whisper of residue." Wolfe finally leaned back, not forward, back. That meant retreat into the fortress of thought, not surrender. He picked up the paper, read, grunted again, and set it down like it had been cooked improperly. I presume the gun did not fire itself, unless it came with a delayed trigger and a grudge. He closed his eyes and pinched the bridge of his nose. "Phooey," he said. "The trouble with facts is that eventually they require explanation." Wolfe stood, which is a little like seeing a mountain rise out of a field. He took 3 steps toward the globe by the window, his version of pacing, and spun it once before stabbing a finger into the North Atlantic, as if blaming the ocean for human idiocy. "She says there were 4 shots," he repeated. "The revolver, I presume, was a 6-chambered .38. Smith & Wesson, 4 spent casings, 2 live ones, all accounted for." He turned, grim. "Then one of those bullets went astray, either into the furniture or into a lie." He paused, then let the line hang like a painting in a bad frame. "I didn't rush to fill it." Wolfe sighed. "A self-inflicted death that requires 3 projectiles lacks conviction. One that includes an extra is absurd. Shall I believe in a man who shoots himself thrice and then aims for decoration?" "If it's staged," I offered. "Someone overthought it." "Yes, and now I must underthink it to correct the balance." He returned to his chair. "Tell Fritz to bring beer, and prepare to receive this, Miss Hart. I detest being expected to act before I am fed." At precisely 11:40, the bell rang. Fritz answered, and a moment later I was standing at the foot of the office stairs, looking at a woman whose face was the blueprint for poise under pressure. Claudia Hart didn't walk into a room. She allowed it to exist with her in it. Tall, not too tall, dressed in something expensive and deliberately unmemorable, she carried a leather folder like it might whisper if squeezed too hard. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, "and I assume that is Mr. Wolfe." Wolfe didn't rise, of course. He offered a tight nod, which for him was the emotional equivalent of a bear hug. "I appreciate your seeing me." Wolfe inclined his head again. "I assume it was unavoidable?" She sat. Not on the edge, not with a collapse, but with that deliberate grace of a person who'd been balancing teacups in hostile rooms since childhood. "My father is dead. The police say suicide. I heard 4 shots. Wolfe laced his fingers. "We are aware." "There were 3 bullets in his body," she continued, tone unwavering. "And I want to know what the 4th one hit." That got his attention, if not his affection. Claudia reached into her folder and slid a photograph onto Wolfe's desk. He glanced at it without touching it, habitual reluctance toward evidence not hand-selected or sterilized. It was a shot of the study, mahogany desk, leather chair, and a conspicuous stain darkening the oriental rug. "There were 3 bullets retrieved from his body," she said, "cool as scotch over ice. But I heard 4. There was a pause between the 3rd and the 4th, and I know the difference between panic and punctuation." Wolfe raised one brow, the left, which always carried more sarcasm than the right. "You believe the 4th shot was not fired in haste, but in design?" "I believe someone made sure it sounded like something it wasn't." I watched Wolfe. His breathing didn't change, but his pupils contracted. For him, that's practically a soliloquy. He steepled his fingers and stared at the photo. "Miss Hart," he said at last, "what you ask is not the solving of a death, it is the interpretation of an intention. That is not a task I undertake lightly." "You're not being asked lightly." He didn't answer, but he didn't send her away. And for Wolfe, silence is just a long, thoughtful maybe. Wolfe named a sum that could have refurbished the Taj Mahal and still left change for cigars. I watched Claudia Hart take it in without blinking, as though he had merely quoted the weather in Tunis. "That will be acceptable," she said, and reached into the folder on her lap. Wolfe's lips compressed the way they do when a bluff folds into a problem. I had seen him use that number before, his version of a no trespassing sign, but Claudia sailed past it like she was born immune to negotiation. He accepted the retainer with a formality that suggested contempt for the necessity, then placed it on his desk as if it were slightly unsanitary. "Miss Hart," he said, steepling his fingers, "I hope you understand that money does not purchase certainty, only attention." "It's your attention I want," she replied, and from the sound of it, she didn't mean mine. "I am listening," Wolfe said. And just like that we were in business, whether Wolfe liked the client or not. He had named his price, and she had bought his curiosity along with it. "My father was hosting 3 guests that night," Claudia began. "His business partner, Carl Fisk, his art advisor, Tamsin Vray, and Jasper Lynn, his assistant." Wolfe closed his eyes. That was not boredom, it was filing. His way of making the machinery inside tick silently, while the rest of us caught up. "I had dinner with them. It was strained. My father and Carl exchanged words about the foundation's direction, and there was some discussion about inheritance. She didn't say it like it embarrassed her, more like it bored her. I suspected that was deliberate. I left the dining room around 10. I went upstairs. The guests lingered and eventually dispersed. At approximately 10:30, I heard the shots, 4 of them, not a rapid burst. 1, then another, then a pause, then 2 more, muffled but distinct. I asked, "You're certain of the count?" "Yes." "Were you wearing heels or just moral authority?" That got nothing but a glance. I marked it down: backbone, dry humor, resistant. Wolfe opened his eyes. "And you went down?" I met Officer Dempsey on the stairs. He had heard the shots from outside and forced the door. My father was already dead. I've heard a lot of stories where the room locked itself and the corpse politely waited for discovery. Claudia's version had fewer frills. "The study door was bolted from the inside," she said. "It required force to break in. Officer Dempsey used his shoulder." Wolfe shifted in his chair the way he does when facts become overly cooperative. "The gun was at my father's side," she continued. "His right hand was near it, palm up. No note, no sign of struggle." "No footprints?" "Smudges, disturbance?" Wolfe asked. "None that were noted, but it was raining earlier, and the carpet is dense." She reached again into the folder, this time producing photographs, clean shots of a tidy death. Wolfe glanced at them, then looked away with mild disgust. "There was no blood spatter inconsistent with the wounds," she said. "But the police believe he shot himself 3 times, in the chest, the shoulder, and the neck." "Ambitious," I said. "Not many suicides like to make a production of it." "Exactly," she said. And with that, the room felt just a little more crowded. 3 guests, a daughter, a corpse, and a question that didn't fit. "There were 3 bullets recovered from the body," Claudia said, "all fired from the revolver." "Which revolver?" Wolfe asked. "A Smith & Wesson .38 belonging to my father, kept in the study drawer." She handed me the forensics report. I gave it a glance, enough to confirm the type and ballistics. "Standard ammunition, no special treatment, 3 entries, 3 exits, neatly catalogued." "But I heard 4, she said again, her voice flat as pressed linen. Wolfe opened one eye. "And the 4th? "No one has accounted for it. There was no damage to the walls or furniture, no shell elsewhere, just 4 discharged chambers, 3 accounted for." "Did you say so to the police?" "They dismissed it. Officer Dempsey didn't question me, and the detective in charge concluded I was overwrought. I don't know many overwrought women who file legal summaries in alphabetical order, but Wolfe and I share the same allergy to lazy assumptions. So we have 1 bullet missing, no wound, no trace, and no curiosity from official channels," I said. "That's correct." Wolfe grunted. "Not a PFUI yet, but getting close." "There is something wrong with the scene," she said, setting down her folder as if it had grown heavy. "My father never would have shot himself that way. He was methodical. If he meant to die, it would have been surgical, not theatrical." "You believe the scene was altered?" Wolfe asked, more as confirmation than curiosity. "Yes." "By whom?" "I don't know, but someone was still downstairs, someone who had reason to want things. Cleaner." That was the closest she came to an accusation, No names, no wild pointing, just the precision of suggestion, which is harder to fight than fury. Carl had reasons to fear disinheritance, she added. Tamsin had personal entanglements. Jasper, she paused. Jasper knew everything. Everything? Wolfe asked. He was my father's memory, and sometimes his conscience. I wrote that down, not because it made sense yet, but because words like that tend to come back with claws. Wolfe closed his eyes again. And you're not curious why a man would need 3 bullets to accomplish what one would do? I'm curious, she said, but I think someone else had the answer before me. After she left, Wolfe said nothing for precisely 30 seconds. That's long enough to plant an orchid, write a check, or change your will, depending on your temperament. Then, names, I obliged. Carl Fisk, business partner, plenty of motive, if Lemuel really did change the will. Tamsin Vray, Wolfe said, tasting the name. An art advisor. And according to last year's tabloids, something more. She was spotted travelling with Hart. They were photographed at an estate sale in Lyon, one in Venice, and a weekend conference in Buenos Aires. Which implies entanglement. Which implies clean-up, I said. Continue. Jasper Lynn, long-time assistant. No known motive unless loyalty has a half-life. Compile their alibis, Wolfe said, and be certain to ask not only where they were during the shots, but who they would lie for. Is that breakfast or strategy? He leaned back. It is both. And so my morning was set. 3 timelines, 1 missing bullet, and more family tension than a 3-hour holiday brunch in Queens. Back at the brownstone, I confirmed the weapon specs. A .38 Smith & Wesson, 6 chambers. 4 had been fired. 2 remained unfired. Wolfe listened with half an ear, but I saw the full calculation behind his closed eyelids. So, I said, if this was suicide, he fired 3 shots at himself, missed 1, or what, changed his mind halfway through? Wolfe grunted. You're attempting to reason backward from nonsense. The math doesn't help, I said. 6 chambers, 4 spent, 3 in the body, 1 missing. He opened his eyes. Which is either lost or placed. Placed. There is a difference, Wolfe said, between a bullet that disappears and a bullet whose absence creates a shape. I didn't press that. Not because I understood it yet, but because he'd just shifted forward an inch in his chair. In Wolfe's language, that was the equivalent of boarding a train. If Hart was ending his life, I said aloud, mostly to the room, why not use all 6? Wolfe didn't reply. He just nodded once and reached for the beer Fritz had left beside his chair. And in that nod I saw the answer forming, not fully shaped, but enough for me to know he'd found the one part of the story that couldn't be made to sit still, which meant, inevitably, that someone else would have to. And when Wolfe decides a question is worth answering, the question usually doesn't survive. The Hart residence had the kind of entrance that wanted to be bowed to, 2 stone lions, an oversized oak door, and the kind of landscaping that whispered generational wealth and recent pruning. I was met not by Claudia, but by a woman in charcoal grey who identified herself only as the housekeeper, with a surname that began and ended in consonants, and a smile that never arrived. She showed me in without ceremony, but with just enough chill in her tone to make it clear I should wipe my feet twice, metaphorically and otherwise. The sitting room smelled faintly of lemon oil and caution. The guests will receive you shortly, she said, then vanished with the kind of economy that suggested years of managing rooms full of people who believed their own taste in wine justified their rudeness. I took a seat and let the silence settle. The Hart place didn't shout, but it didn't whisper either. It watched. Which was fine by me. I do some of my best work when furniture is suspicious. Then a door creaked open and Carl Fisk entered with a smile that arrived a full second before the rest of him. Carl Fisk looked like money that had started to fray. Crisp suit, tasteful tie, and just enough tan to suggest recent proximity to a yacht, though probably not ownership. He extended a hand and a smile simultaneously. Mr. Goodwin, Miss Hart said you might be visiting. I'm surprised Mr. Wolfe didn't come himself." "Mr. Wolfe has strong views about vertical motion," I said. "I do the travelling, he does the thinking." Carl laughed too quickly and sat across from me, elbows loose, ankles crossed, confidence rehearsed. "I suppose Claudia has you chasing ghosts," he said. "She's always had a dramatic streak, even as a girl." "Does hearing 4 gunshots instead of 3 qualify as dramatic or simply attentive?" He didn't flinch, but his collar tightened just a bit. "She's grieving. You can't hold her to forensic precision. It's all so unfortunate." "Unfortunate tends to show up in revolvers and inheritance arguments." His lips twitched. Lemuel was complicated. He could be harsh. If someone's guilt made them hear 1 too many shots, well, I'd call that a symptom, not a clue. I made a mental note. Carl Fisk didn't sweat easily. But when he did, it was at the temples, just above the line of plausible deniability. Tamsin Vray was the kind of woman who wore intellectual elegance like other people wore scarves, effortlessly and just shy of showing off. She greeted me with a handshake colder than a banker's condolence, and eyes that flicked to the folder I was carrying before landing back on mine. "I don't suppose you're here for a landscape appraisal," she said. Her voice had the tone of someone who could distinguish between irony and sarcasm, but chose not to. "Strictly the human terrain today," I replied. She smiled, but not at me. "Then you'll find the soil here acidic." We sat. She crossed her legs with surgical precision and waited for me to earn the next sentence. I didn't rush. "I'm told you were here the night Lemuel died." "I was," she said. "And I left shortly before the shot, or shots, depending on who's hearing them." "Did you hear 4? "I heard grief coming," she said. "Not the arithmetic of it." That wasn't an answer, but it was an artful dodge, and the more she spoke, the more I noticed something. She only referred to Claudia in the present tense. Everyone else got the past. Jasper Lynn was the last of the trio and the only one who didn't bother to smile. He had the posture of a man trying to apologize for his height and the manner of someone who memorized dates for comfort. He led me to the study with the quiet reverence of a docent at a cathedral. "I maintained the archives," he said. "Inventory, correspondences, the will. Mr. Hart was very exacting." "And on the night he died?" "I was upstairs cataloguing receipts," he said. "I came down when I heard—" He paused, brow tightening. "3 shots, he finished. "Are you sure?" "I am, fairly sure," he said. "I counted 3. Claudia says 4. His lips moved, but the words took a detour. Perhaps she was mistaken. I let that hang. Jasper was the kind of man who kept track of postage rates for sport. If he said 3, he meant 3, but he didn't look convinced, even of his own memory. I thanked him, but in my head I underlined the pause. Because sometimes what people don't remember is exactly what they're trying to forget. Orrin Dempsey was the kind of man who had once leaned his weight on a door and expected it to surrender out of respect. His handshake was solid, but not showy, and his eyes held the practiced distance of someone who had watched too many explanations fall apart under cross-examination. "I was walking past the garden wall," he said. "Wasn't on duty, but I still know what a shot sounds like. I heard 4. He didn't embellish, no dramatics, just the number. 4? You're certain? 3 for sure. The 4th, maybe an echo. Or a late bounce off a window. It was wet that night. Sound travels funny when it's humid." I didn't correct him because I didn't need to. He was doing what honest men do when something doesn't fit. They round it off until it passes inspection. "You told this to the investigating officer?" "Didn't get that far. By the time they were taking statements, they'd already decided it was suicide. Didn't want to complicate things." He meant for them, not for him. But sometimes complications don't wait for permission. And this one, I suspected, had already started to multiply. Back inside the study, I took another pass, not because I expected the walls to confess, but because they were too neat not to be lying. The desk was clear, too clear, not a single loose paper, not even a forgotten fountain pen. Hart had kept things orderly, but even orderly men leave trails. This had been scrubbed, not bleached, but curated, like a museum after a quiet heist. The glass display case in the corner was shattered, its base intact, but the glass itself in shards, swept to one side like someone meant to clean up, and then got interrupted by murder. And then there was the wall. A rectangular space above the credenza, slightly brighter than the rest, suggested something had hung there. Not just art, but a memory. The kind of thing you don't move unless you're trying to erase the shape it left behind. I checked the window. Unlatched, open wide enough for someone to exit, or at least toss something out. Wind had blown the edge of the rug over on itself, but that wasn't the kind of detail the police report had included. Sometimes what's missing is louder than what's left, and right now the silence was beginning to yell. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was in what I refer to as his sedentary storm phase. He hadn't budged from his chair, but mentally he was pacing a hole through the parquet. I handed him the set of interior photographs Claudia had supplied, pre-renovation, post-installation, and one dated barely 3 weeks before Lemuel Hart decided, or was convinced, to cease living. He studied them without expression, which meant his mind was already 10 moves ahead. "This one," he said finally, tapping the image with his forefinger. "Here." It was the study, Hart's desk, the bookshelves, the credenza, and centered above the chair a framed portrait. Wolfe leaned closer. "A woman," he said. "Older, unsmiling, oil on canvas, positioned deliberately, removed purposefully." I nodded. "The wall where it hung has a clean mark, like a ghost that got evicted." Wolfe closed his eyes. The effort to remove a painting is not inconsiderable, especially one large enough to cover the torso of a seated man. And yet it vanished. "Not vanished," Wolfe murmured. "Repositioned, perhaps even repurposed." He didn't say more, but when he began theorizing the logistics of a missing oil painting, it wasn't for the sake of art appreciation, it was for the geometry of murder. I don't make a habit of crawling along window ledges, even metaphorically, but curiosity has its own rules, and this one was beginning to smell too quiet. The window in Hart's study faced the garden. The sill had dust in the corners, untouched, but something gleamed near the hinge. I bent down, used a folded card from my wallet, and coaxed it loose. It was a sliver, oil paint, aged and brittle, curled at one edge like it had been torn by force and not age. Not a fingerprint, exactly. More like a whisper that someone had tried to silence. I bagged it and made a mental note to have it compared to the pigments in the photo Wolfe had studied. He wouldn't need confirmation, he'd already made the connection. But it's one thing to know and another to have proof the police can't ignore. Back inside, I jotted notes. Angle, sill height, estimated trajectory. Because when something leaves in a hurry, especially something as heavy as truth, it tends to leave scratches. Claudia didn't knock. She entered the office like she still belonged to the world her father had just vacated, and maybe still owned a piece of it. "I thought you should see this," she said, unfolding a tri-folded legal document and placing it on Wolfe's desk with a precision that wasn't accidental. Wolfe raised an eyebrow. I read. It was the latest revision of Lemuel Hart's will, dated 10 days before his death. Carl Fisk, previously a major beneficiary, had been removed entirely, and Jasper Lynn, the quiet, methodical assistant, with a tendency to vanish in plain sight, had been added. Wolfe didn't reach for it. He merely inclined his head toward me, which meant read it aloud, if it's worth my time. I obliged. When I finished, Claudia said nothing. Wolfe, however, exhaled once through his nose. It wasn't quite a laugh, but it was close enough to make the orchids quiver. And just like that, the estate had motive, the quiet man had a question mark, and the canvas behind the desk began to feel a little heavier. When Wolfe tells me a case is beneath him, it usually means He's seen the shape of the thing and doesn't care for the silhouette. That morning, he made the declaration with a snort and a motionless shrug, both of which in Wolfe's vocabulary mean, I could solve this standing still, but why should I bother? She has paid the fee, he admitted, but not my interest. That's a new one, I said. Client secures the retainer but fails to amuse. Facts must first resist the obvious, he muttered, before they're worthy of reflection. So he sat. He read Pliny. He consumed a Bavarian egg dish that could have intimidated a small goat. He told Fritz not to answer the phone until noon. In short, he waited for what he called the inevitable, official stupidity. I had $20 riding on which part of the anatomy would act first, the police's pride or their poor judgment. I lost. It turned out to be both. And when the phone finally rang, Wolfe didn't even flinch. He just closed his book and said, "Well, that didn't take long." Kramer's voice over the line had the warmth of a wet match. "She confessed to hearing 4 shots, he said, which, considering there were 3 wounds, puts her at the scene either lying or hallucinating. Or listening, I said. "She didn't hear wrong, Goodwin. She heard too much. That's the difference." He clicked off before I could offer my condolences for his reasoning. When I told Wolfe, he didn't blink. His hands folded across his belly as if he were absorbing indigestion from the very concept of police logic. "A woman tells the truth," he said, "and that becomes evidence of guilt. Welcome to jurisprudence house style. She will be processed, detained, and questioned with the delicacy of a fishmonger sorting live eels." He made no movement toward the phone, but his fingers tapped twice against the armrest, a rare Wolfian tick. I knew then that the game had just become personal, not because Wolfe believed in Claudia's innocence, but because someone had forced his hand. And if there's one thing Nero Wolfe doesn't tolerate, it's being invited to a farce and then told he can't write the ending. Wolfe's patience is a complicated thing. It's not endless, it's rationed, like caviar or metaphors. By 11:30, with Claudia cooling behind precinct walls and Kramer polishing his badge on bad logic, Wolfe abandoned his abstention. He summoned me into the office with a single word. "Fisk." I raised an eyebrow. "Carl? There are 2 Fisks in this case?" "Not unless he's breeding." Wolfe's lips flattened like underbaked pastry. "I want every financial footprint, personal, professional, and opportunistic." "You want proof he wanted Lemuel dead?" I want proof Lemuel wanted him dead. That will suffice." I grabbed my hat, not because I needed it indoors, but because it helped me think like a man with a purpose. Wolfe added, as I reached the door, "Find the rot, Archie, preferably before lunch." "I assume that's my deadline?" "Number it's Fritz's. I would rather digest scandal than injustice," which in Wolfe's world meant he was angry. And if I did my job properly, he'd soon have a reason to turn that anger into clarity. Carl Fisk's public facade had the gleam of a man who never paid full price and made you feel guilty for suspecting it. But behind the curtain of polite invoices and well-structured emails was a stack of ledgers that told a much simpler story. He'd been bleeding Hart Art Holdings for nearly 4 years, small transfers at first, cleverly buried under discretionary acquisitions, then bolder sums shuffled through a dummy holding company named Elixius Limited, which, despite the Latin flourish, existed nowhere outside a Cayman Island P.O. box and a Manhattan mailbox drop. He used the funds to cover personal investments gone sideways, a private collection of mid-century surrealists, a failed gallery partnership in Soho, and, in one glorious misfire, an avant-garde sculptor who built chairs you couldn't sit in. I assembled the paper trail. Wolfe didn't like digital copies, so I printed everything. Double-spaced, single-sided, just the way he liked his corruption. Easy to read, impossible to deny. When I handed it over, Wolfe didn't say thank you. He just stared at the figures for a moment, then muttered. Lemuel Hart had begun writing the final paragraph. Someone decided to write it for him. Fisk was on the phone with Tamsin Vray, I told Wolfe. 10:23 to 10:31, 8 full minutes, cell tower confirms, landline matches. Her statement and the records agree. Wolfe scowled, which on him is a slight contraction of the left cheek and the flattening of already flat lips. Too convenient, he said. Maybe, but it's the kind of convenience that tends to come with timestamps. Unless it was staged, he said. Or covered. He talked about auction prep. She responded. I listened to the recording. Wolfe closed his eyes and leaned back as if insulted by modern technology's refusal to corroborate his suspicions. He cannot have shot Hart if he was on the phone. Unless he used telekinesis. Wolfe opened one eye. Phooey. It wasn't defeat, just recognition of a hurdle. Carl Fisk was dirty, that much was clear, but this particular pile of dirt had arrived too late, or too early, to explain the fourth bullet. And Wolfe, for all his distaste for emotional speculation, was beginning to suspect the motive wasn't financial. It was aesthetic. Wolfe hates showmanship. He believes facts should be presented like good cheese, unadorned, well-aged, and impossible to fake. So when he called the fourth bullet a performance, I knew he wasn't being poetic. It was not fired in fear, he said. It was placed. Bullets don't usually get choreographed. They do when the shooter wants to tell a story. I sat back. A suicide with one bullet is tragic. With two, it's desperate. With three, it's excessive. But with four, it's an alibi, Wolfe said, for someone else. He stood, not a full rise, just a half-inch of gravitational protest, and leaned on the desk. The killer did not wish merely to kill, they wished to convince. Convince who? Everyone. He tapped the table twice. The scene was arranged to pass inspection. 3 wounds, locked door, gun nearby. But the fourth bullet, placed where it would confuse, not clarify, was not an error. It was the final brushstroke on a painting meant to be mistaken for truth. He said it like it tasted bitter, like someone had dared to stage a lie in a way that mimicked Wolfe's own taste for symmetry, and worse, had almost gotten away with it. I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. What kind of killer adds a bullet after the job's done? Wolfe didn't look up. The kind who wants a story to tell. He said it with disdain, as if literature itself had offended him. A murderer who needs belief must become a dramatist. He or she composes a scene. And composition is an act of control. So the fourth bullet isn't an accident. It is a signature, Wolfe said, or worse, an edit. I watched him close the file on Carl Fisk and push it aside. Not discarded, relegated. It meant we had left theft behind and entered theatre. And somewhere in that fourth shot was a line the killer couldn't help but write. I didn't say it aloud, but I felt it. Someone had rehearsed this. The angles, the echoes, the locked door. Only problem? The audience was starting to ask questions. Just as things began to settle into their uncomfortable rhythm, the rug jerked sideways. Orrin Dempsey was found dead in his car, engine still idling, body slumped over the wheel, a single bullet to the back of the head. The report came by phone, delivered in Kramer's voice, more gravel than usual. No theory, no suspects, just a statement and silence. I hung up and looked at Wolfe. Echo Man is gone. He didn't speak, just reached for his beer, took a long sip, and said, "This is not escalation. It is concealment." Dempsey saw something. He heard something, and perhaps later understood it. The car had been parked 2 blocks from his apartment. No signs of struggle, no note, no robbery, just a clean kill and an open question, the kind of question Wolfe couldn't ignore. I watched him close his eyes and breathe, once. It wasn't meditation, it was preparation. Wolfe dropped his fork, not flung, not tossed, simply let it go, and it struck the edge of his plate with a sound that suggested not hunger, but heresy. He glared at the limp slice of pheasant on his plate, like it had committed a logical fallacy. "This is no longer a murder," he said. "It is erasure." I let that hang. When Wolfe upgraded a homicide to something more conceptual, it usually meant his appetite had encountered a contradiction it couldn't digest. He pushed the plate away and leaned back. To kill is an act, he said. But to remove, to delete the context, to frame the corpse in a false pose is something else. It is not the crime of violence. It is the crime of narrative. Someone rewrote the ending, I said. No, he corrected. Someone rewrote the preface and left us reading an epilogue written in lies. I didn't argue, not just because he was right, but because he was full of logic, of fury, and, very soon, of purpose. And when Wolfe decided a lie was too well told, the only acceptable outcome was its public dismantling. It turned out Orrin Dempsey hadn't just heard too much, he'd seen too much too, and the thing he'd seen had teeth. Before he wound up slumped in his car with the neat punctuation of a bullet in the back of his head, he'd taken a walk along the Hudson, following a gut instinct older than his retirement badge. That instinct led him to a patch of brush behind a municipal storage yard where, beneath a tarp and 3 rusted lawn chairs, he found the missing painting. Not stolen, not sold, discarded, as if it had been contaminated. When the uniformed officer handed it to me, wrapped like something contagious, I didn't need to guess which painting it was. The back bore the Hart Estates catalogue sticker, and the front, though warped by moisture, held the unmistakable portrait of Claudia's mother, her expression still and tragic, with one fresh addition, a bullet hole, dead center, just below the cheekbone. Dempsey had called no one, no report filed, just a quiet note to himself, folded in his wallet. Check angle, canvas line, doesn't fit. It fit now, too late for him, maybe just in time for us. I brought the canvas into the brownstone myself. Wolfe doesn't normally allow wet things into his office unless they're infused with stock and served in porcelain, but he made an exception for this one. It was a portrait, all right. Formal oil, early 1950s, done in a restrained style that spoke of money, restraint, and repressed sentiment. The subject was a woman in her 40s, dignified but unsmiling. Claudia's mother, no doubt. The resemblance was softened by time and varnish, but unmistakable. And there, where the curve of the left cheek met the line of the jaw, was the hole, small, clean, burned at the edge. A bullet had gone in with no warning and no right. Wolfe didn't touch it. He didn't need to. It was behind him, he said. Deliberately placed, a backboard, to support the lie. 4 shots, I said. 3 in Hart, 1 in her. In her image, Wolfe corrected. The killer chose the canvas with intent. The bullet passed through the illusion of memory to reinforce the illusion of suicide. That's how Wolfe thinks, not just who or how, but why there and why that face, which meant he already suspected whom the lie was meant to protect. Wolfe stared at the painting longer than he stared at most people. He studied the angle of entry, the depth of the wound in pigment and canvas, and the placement of soot where the frame had caught some of the residue. He didn't need a ballistics report to tell him what the eye already confirmed. The shot was fired downward, he said, but not steeply. From a standing position, the revolver placed behind the victim angled slightly forward. He nodded toward the base of the canvas. The range, close, within a foot, intimate, and carefully aligned. I said, You think Hart was already dead? I do not think, Mr. Goodwin. I observe. He lifted his gaze. The first shots were desperate, but this was composition. The killer staged the study not as a man's tomb, but as his confession. Then why shoot the portrait? Because a canvas absorbs truth more quietly than flesh. He stood slowly and walked to the globe. Whoever staged it, he said, rotating the continents without interest, understood 2 things: art forgives and the police forget. He stopped the globe with a finger. I intend to do neither. Wolfe did not require further confirmation from police forensics. He had the painting, the path of the bullet, the geometry of a chair, and the mind of a man intolerant of performance without principle. The canvas, he said, was not merely removed from the wall, it was relocated, propped behind the body, positioned at chest height, upright, and angled slightly inward. To catch the 4th, I said. To contain it, Wolfe corrected. To create the illusion of a close-range shot. one that would suggest a final act of self-directed resolve. Only Hart was already dead. Precisely. The wounds that killed him were earlier, messier. This final shot had elegance. It was meant for a viewer. He paused. A medical examiner, perhaps? A daughter? Or a conscience? Whose? I am not yet certain, but the act is unmistakable. He turned to me, his gaze narrowed. Imagine what it takes, Archie, not to shoot a man in anger, but to return, reposition his corpse and fire a final bullet after his silence has begun. Calculation, I said. No, he murmured. Necessity, the kind that grows from shame, not greed. And just like that, the motive moved, not outward, but inward. When Claudia Hart walked out of the precinct, she wasn't wearing vindication. She wore something closer to dust, an invisible residue of being misunderstood, processed, and temporarily presumed capable of killing her own father with method and intent. Wolfe hadn't accompanied me to deliver the findings. That honor fell to Inspector Kramer, who didn't thank us, but also didn't argue when presented with a bullet path through a missing portrait and a body whose final wound didn't match its timeline. Claudia didn't ask for details. She didn't want them. She only nodded, murmured that she'd send a fresh copy of the will, and left with her jaw tighter than it had been on our first meeting. I watched her go. She was free, yes, but freedom in these cases isn't a clean exit. It's a hallway with the lights off. And something told me she hadn't reached the end of it yet. Jasper Lynn had always been a quiet man, quiet like wallpaper is quiet, present, unnoticed, and holding the room together in ways no one acknowledges until it starts peeling. But now he was unraveling. When I returned to the Hart residence to retrieve the painting's original frame, at Wolfe's request, Jasper met me at the door with a look that had misplaced time. "Mr. Goodwin?" he said, then blinked. "Or, no, you're not the driver. Forgive me." I wasn't offended. What struck me was the sincerity of his confusion. He recovered quickly, offered tea, and misnamed the brand. Twice. While he retrieved the frame, I wandered through his office. It had the clinical neatness of a man who files to remember. Only now, half the labels were upside down. On the way out, he muttered, "They all knew. Even her. He told me that once." "Who knew what?" I asked. He didn't answer. Or maybe he couldn't. Jasper hadn't cracked, not yet. But something in him had softened, like varnish on an old canvas, just enough to start letting the light through. And Wolfe would want to know what it was shining on. The envelope arrived late afternoon. No stamp, no return address, hand-delivered by someone who bypassed Fritz's scrutiny and left it wedged between the brass knocker and Wolfe's distaste for unannounced messages. I opened it. One sheet, typewritten, the kind of paper you buy in bulk when you intend to be anonymous. "You're clever, but not bulletproof." I read it twice, handed it over, and waited. Wolfe took it without comment, held it at a distance like it might emit smoke, and read. Then he folded it once, precisely, and dropped it into the ashtray. A flick of a match, a breath, and the paper curled into itself, blackened, and vanished. He didn't look at me. "Fear," he said, "has no business dictating intellect." "Any chance it's a prank?" "Pranks seek amusement. This seeks silence." I watched the last curl of smoke spiral upward. Wolfe never burned things without purpose, and when he did, it was never out of panic. "It's an admission," he said. "Not of guilt, but of proximity. Someone has come close enough to notice. That makes them careless." He reached for the bell that summoned Fritz. "Prepare dinner. Tonight we will not be unarmed." And I knew he didn't mean weapons. He meant conclusions. When Wolfe summons an audience, he doesn't do it with trumpets or theatrics. He does it with one clipped sentence and a tone that tells you whether you're being invited to dinner or to confession. That afternoon, the tone suggested neither. What it did suggest was that something inside him had finally snapped, not with noise, but with calculation. The suspects arrived in silence. Claudia, poised but distant. Tamsin Vray, all elegance and disdain. Carl Fisk, polished as ever. And Jasper, ashen, already shifting in his seat like he knew something was about to be lifted off him. Wolfe didn't greet them. He didn't rise. He looked over them like a king surveying the battleground from a comfortable throne. "You will answer questions," he said. "Succinctly. And you will refrain from dramatics. I find them redundant." His voice was half an octave colder than usual. That small drop in temperature had the same effect as a loaded gun on a polished table. No immediate threat, but nobody mistook it for decoration. And then, with no ceremony at all, he began. "There were 4 shots," Wolfe said. "We are told." Silence. "One of those shots was not like the others. Not merely in position or purpose, but in timing. I wish to know where each of you was between the 3rd and the 4th. He let that sit. Too short for a pause, too long for comfort. Claudia answered first. "I was upstairs. I didn't move." Tamsin Vray. "I had left. I was halfway to my car." Carl Fisk. "In the drawing room, pouring a drink." Jasper Lynn. "I was in the west corridor, listening." Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "Listening," he repeated. "To what?" "Footsteps." And then? Another silence. This one had weight. "I heard the door open." "Which door?" "The study." Wolfe leaned forward. "And?" A beat passed. Jasper's hand twitched against the side of his chair. "I heard someone leave." No one breathed. Wolfe's voice was low, but it landed like thunder. "After the 4th shot?" "Yes." Then silence again. But this time it wasn't peace. It was prelude. Wolfe let the silence stretch until it became unbearable, then snapped it like a dry twig. "You saw them, Mr. Lynn?" Jasper's mouth opened, but no sound came. His hands, folded neatly in his lap moments ago, now gripped the edge of the chair. "You saw who left the study after the final shot?" I shouldn't. You will," Wolfe said. No threat. Just inevitability, voiced in baritone. Jasper looked to Claudia, then to the floor, then foolishly to me, as if I might have an easier truth in my pocket. "Speak," Wolfe said. Jasper tried. He did, but the words got caught somewhere between obligation and fear. His lips trembled. Yes, I saw someone." Wolfe's voice was almost kind. "And?" Jasper closed his eyes, not in resistance, but in surrender. But he said nothing more. He had cracked, yes, but the name, it seemed, was stuck in the debris. And Wolfe, ever the craftsman, wasn't finished applying pressure. "I saw them leave," Jasper said so quietly it almost passed for an exhale. Wolfe did not react. He didn't move a single inch. "Who?" I asked. Jasper shook his head. "Number not like this." "You recognized them?" Wolfe said. "Yes." "You're protecting someone?" Jasper's mouth twisted. "I'm protecting what's left of them." Wolfe's tone sharpened. "You mean their reputation?" "I mean their life." A pause. Then Wolfe said, "Why?" Jasper swallowed. "Because I loved them." The words dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Not a declaration, not an alibi, a statement of fact, so simple it almost escaped analysis. Wolfe said nothing. Neither did I. Tamsin's eyes didn't move. Claudia's did. Carl looked baffled, which for him was an improvement. Jasper turned his face away, and in that moment I knew, Wolfe knew, that the heart of the crime wasn't money or art. It was intimacy, and it had been bleeding beneath the surface since the first bullet left the chamber. "You love them," Wolfe repeated. Jasper didn't lift his eyes. "Yes." Was it Miss Hart? Silence. "Tamsin Vray?" More silence. Wolfe leaned forward. "The dead man!" At that, Jasper flinched, not violently, but as if struck by an unexpected gust of wind. He shook his head once. "Then speak," Wolfe said, with the weight of an ancient judge issuing sentence. Jasper folded in on himself, spine curled like old parchment. "I won't." "Because it would condemn them? Because it would break them?" He said it plainly, and Wolfe, to my surprise, let it rest. No more prodding. No more syllogisms. Just a long, low breath as Wolfe leaned back and turned his attention elsewhere. The name was not offered, not today, but in the refusal, Wolfe had gained something just as telling, a radius of guilt. And now it was only a matter of tracing the shadow back to the hand that cast it. Wolfe summoned Kramer, not with fanfare, but with a statement. The case is no longer opaque, only incomplete. Kramer arrived with his usual bouquet of skepticism, which he laid on Wolfe's desk without bothering to tie a ribbon. "I want facts," he said, "not poetry." "You shall have both," Wolfe replied. He recited what we had. Lemuel Hart, shot thrice, died once. A fourth bullet fired post-mortem into a portrait, staged to sell a story. A forged will, a missing painting, a too convenient alibi, and now a silent witness clinging to the last dignity of love. "Motives," Wolfe said, "abound." "Means in part, but what we lack is permission. The players refuse to speak plainly, and thus the play stalls." Kramer grunted. "So it's not solved." "It is cornered," Wolfe said, "and cornered things eventually leap. I want something that bites." "You'll have it," Wolfe said. "Soon." Kramer stood, looked to me, and said, "If he's bluffing, it's the longest game I've seen." I shrugged. "Bluffing is for card tables. Wolfe prefers checkmate." He left, and Wolfe reached for his beer, not with satisfaction, but with appetite. It was past 10 when the call came through. Carl Fisk had been found in his study, head back, mouth slack, glass in hand, scotch in the bottle, cyanide in the scotch. Wolfe took the news with the same expression he wore when Fritz undercooked the duck, one brow arched, the other lowered, and a sigh that came not from surprise but from expectation, fulfilled. "No fingerprints," I said. Bottle was on his desk. No one remembers bringing it in, not even the housekeeper. "Because it wasn't brought," Wolfe said. "It was placed." I nodded. "Clever. No injection, no bruising. He poured his own drink. He just didn't know what was in it." "Poison," Wolfe said, "is cowardly in method, but specific in purpose." He knew something. He tried to use something. Blackmail, probably, or leverage that backfired. I watched Wolfe lean back and close his eyes, not for rest, but for war. 3 deaths now and the noose tightening. And somewhere in the dark, the killer was still composing their final act. But Wolfe was already rehearsing the curtain line. Wolfe was seated behind his desk with the poise of a man reconstructing a battlefield from an armchair. I was across from him, notebook open, pen idle, as he let his gaze drift inward into the silent theatre behind his eyes. "One," he said. "To the shoulder, from the side. The angle suggests motion, close contact, perhaps a struggle." He paused, allowing me to scribble what I already knew. "2," he continued. "Lower abdomen. Crude, unpremeditated, delivered in haste, not designed to kill instantly, but it did damage." I nodded. "That's the one the doc said would have done him in. Eventually." Wolfe gave me a withering glance. "I am uninterested in eventually. I am reconstructing a sequence, not a prognosis." He raised a finger. 3. Chest, central. Executed while the victim was on the floor, a cessation shot. Not necessary, but precise. "And 4? I prompted. He closed his eyes briefly. "Not to the body, to the canvas. It came last. It was fired after the blood had settled, the hands had stilled." "So not murder?" "No," Wolfe said. "Not in function. It was punctuation." He opened his eyes. "And as with any dangerous sentence, the punctuation alters the meaning." Wolfe's thumb brushed lightly along the ridge of his chin, a motion that meant the pieces had finally stopped resisting arrangement. "The painting," he said, "was never the victim. It was the accomplice." That got a raised eyebrow from me. "Whoever fired that final shot," he continued, "did so not in passion or panic, but in postlude. After the life had ended, after Lemuel Hart was no longer a man, but an emblem." I watched him tap a finger on the armrest in rhythm with the words. "They removed the portrait from the wall. They set it on a chair, not on the floor, not askew, but upright, symmetrical, centered behind the corpse." "Why the chair?" I asked. "To raise the canvas," Wolfe said, to match the height of a seated man's head, to align the muzzle to the illusion. He leaned forward slightly. They wanted it to read like a suicide. The angle of the shot, the trajectory, the composition theatrical, I said. Wolfe gave a curt nod. Yes, but not clumsy. Whoever arranged it knew that death alone is never convincing. It must be curated. And the implication hovered in the air. Someone in that house was a gifted curator of lies. Wolfe, when he chose to lecture, could outmatch any courtroom or pulpit. And that day his lecture was on smoke and mirrors, or more precisely, powder burns and trajectory lines. The fourth shot, he said, was executed with admirable cunning. It was not the bullet that concerned the killer, but what clung to it. I gave him a look to keep him talking. He obliged. Gunpowder residue disperses at close range. The presence of stippling would suggest a self-inflicted wound. Hence, the shooter fired close to the canvas, at a range consistent with suicide. And the canvas was placed behind Lemuel's head, I offered. Exactly. The residue then not only marked the painting, but gave credence to the illusion. A lazy coroner, of which there are multitudes, would note the burn pattern and nod. Case closed. Wolfe's voice took on a sharper edge. But the canvas was dry, the paint brittle. A fragment of oil flake on your garden sill confirms it had been moved. So the killer cared about how it looked, I said. No, Wolfe murmured. They cared how it would be interpreted. He reached for his beer. Appearance, Mr. Goodwin, is often a more lethal weapon than intent. When Wolfe leans back in his chair and speaks with his eyelids lowered, it means he's telling you the truth no one wanted to say aloud. This was not a crime of avarice, he said. It was a crime of shame. I set down my notebook. That wasn't something you scribbled, that was something you absorbed. Wolfe went on. The staging, the precision, the delayed final shot, it speaks not of impulse but preservation. The victim was already dying. The fourth shot was not vengeance, it was protection. I asked, protection for whom? For someone whose ruin would ripple outward, a reputation, a bond, perhaps even a name. He waved a hand, impatient with speculation. There was something delicate in the house that night, something not meant to be exposed, and this elaborate masquerade was designed to bury it before the worms arrived. He opened his eyes again. It is rarely money that drives men to such choreography, Archie. It is love, or its more desperate cousin, fear of disgrace. The word disgrace settled like ash in the air. And in that silence, I knew we were closer to the heart of it than anyone dared admit. Wolfe's index finger made a slow ascent, hovering in mid-air like a punctuation mark that hadn't decided on its sentence. His tone, when he spoke, was not cruel, only inescapable. Lemuel Hart, he said, stumbled upon a personal entanglement that offended both his pride and his doctrine of lineage. I raised an eyebrow. You're saying he found out about Claudia and Tamsin? He inclined his head ever so slightly. Discovered, concluded, perhaps merely suspected, but sufficient to ignite that peculiar blend of paternal revulsion and wounded self-importance. And his solution, I said, was to cut Claudia out of the will? Precisely, Wolfe said, not because she loved a woman, but because she loved that woman, Tamsin Vray, a painter, a foreigner, a name that could not be written neatly into the Hart family ledger. He looked at me as if I might need it explained further. I didn't. So Lemuel thought he was protecting the family line, I said. And Tamsin saw it as erasure. Wolfe nodded once. Love, Mr. Goodwin, when mingled with the threat of annihilation, becomes a volatile solvent. It does not clarify, it corrodes. And for the first time since the canvas bled, the motive no longer felt like theory, it felt personal. Jasper Lynn didn't so much confess as unravel. It was Wolfe who tugged at the thread, and I had a front-row seat to the unwinding. I altered the signature, Jasper whispered, but not the terms. Wolfe, seated with his hands folded over his considerable middle, made no motion of triumph. only a mild sigh, as though the universe had finally admitted what he already knew. "I saw the new draft," Jasper continued. "Lemuel had removed Claudia entirely, said she was no longer of proper disposition. It made my stomach turn. I kept my mouth shut and my pencil ready." "He left it unsigned," Jasper said. "Left it on the desk. I took the old will, copied the signature, and placed it back." "For whom?" Wolfe asked. "Not for myself. I don't want a cent. I've had a salary and quiet mornings. That's all I ever asked." Wolfe nodded. "Then you forged for loyalty." "Yes," Jasper said, "for Claudia." The silence that followed wasn't approval. It wasn't absolution either. It was just the echo of a truth that made sense, and hurt more for it. "Fritz," Wolfe said, with the deep finality of a man composing the last movement of a symphony, "we shall have duck." Fritz, who had appeared at the door like an unbidden thought, gave a solemn nod. "Pomeranian or Mandarin?" "Pomeranian," Wolfe said, "with braised endive, and dessert must be fig clafoutis." I knew better than to ask if this sudden culinary indulgence was meant to honour the dead, the living, or some abstract midpoint in between. Wolfe's stomach had its own moral compass. "And guests," Wolfe added. "They will arrive at 7, all of them." I straightened in my chair. "You're calling them in?" "I am inviting them," he corrected, with civility, as befits a man about to disassemble lies while the sauce is still warm. He turned to Amy. "You will compose the notes by hand, heavy cream stock, black ink. Begin with 'Your presence is requested,' and mean it." I opened my notebook. "Formal dinner, 7 sharp, no escape clause." Wolfe leaned back. "There will be one more story told at that table, Mr. Goodwin, and unlike the last one, this one will be true." I folded my notebook, slowly. Because when Wolfe sets the table, the knives are not always for the duck. When Fritz served the coffee, he did it with an air of restraint that suggested a funeral mass rather than a dinner party. The table was bare, save for porcelain, bitterness, and Wolfe's silent demand for obedience. 4 guests were present, none of them hungry. Claudia Hart perched upright, rigid enough to be mistaken for a mannequin in mourning. Tamsin Vray's smile was more architectural than emotional. Jasper Lynn looked like a man who had misplaced both his composure and his last 3 nights of sleep. And Inspector Kramer, summoned but unappeased, sat like a brick wall with a badge. Wolfe cleared his throat, a signal that negotiations with decency had ended. "This is not a parlour, and we are not gathered for pleasantries," he began, his voice, smooth as butter left out too long. "You will listen, you will consider, and, God willing, you will speak." He sipped his coffee with an ecclesiastical slowness, then allowed his gaze to move across the room like a searchlight. "One among you has made a masterpiece of deception. I intend to unframe it." And with that, he rose, reluctantly, but with purpose, which, for Wolfe, is a declaration of war. It's not every day Wolfe stands. When he does, it's usually because something in the structure of justice has tilted just enough to annoy him. This time, it was more than annoyance. It was architecture in collapse. He stepped forward as though the floor owed him explanation. "You will not interrupt me," he declared. "If you feel compelled to speak, resist. This is not a trial. It is a reckoning." He placed a finger on the arm of his chair, not to steady himself, but to remind it who ruled the room. Then he began. "Lemuel Hart died not from greed or rage alone, but from an orchestration of vanity. Someone killed him twice, first with a bullet, then with a portrait." A sharp inhale from Claudia, a glance from Tamsin that landed nowhere. "The crime was not spontaneous. It was curated. The 4th shot was not necessity. It was narrative, a lie pinned to the dead." Wolfe turned slightly, angling his words like a blade. "And now I will peel away the varnish." He paused, not for effect, but to give the guilty a moment to sweat in silence. Wolfe moved to the bookshelf, not for a volume, but for posture, and continued as if each syllable were laced with steam. "Tamsin Vray," he said, not asking, but assigning. "The first bullet was yours." No one moved, not even Tamsin. You were alone with Lemuel, argument, accusation. Perhaps something unspeakable crossed his lips, something about Claudia. You reached for the revolver in a moment you hoped would stay momentary. He let the suggestion settle like dust. The second and third shots were not impulse, they were calculus. You chose to remain, to tidy the scene, to make of it a portrait. Wolfe closed his eyes briefly. You fired the fourth round into the painting, Claudia's mother. The irony was not lost on you, I think. It told the story you needed: suicide, remorse, blood, and legacy framed in oil. Tamsin's mouth twitched, not quite denial, not quite confession. You stayed to author the tragedy, but it was never yours to write. His words echoed into the room's corners. And then, with all the weight of a man who hates movement and lies in equal measure, Wolfe turned back toward his chair. Wolfe remained standing. For effect? Possibly. For emphasis? Certainly. He folded his hands as if preparing a sermon. The deception might have held, briefly, had it not been for a thing forgotten: curiosity. Or in Dempsey's Claudia flinched. Jasper swallowed air. Wolfe pressed on. Dempsey discovered the discarded painting where you left it, hidden, but not far, a relic with a cavity. He saw what you overlooked, the bullet's signature lodged beneath a cheek that once smiled for a brush. I remembered Dempsey's face in the morgue, calm, except for the hole that wasn't there the day before. He brought it to no one, not yet. He parked in the driveway and hesitated, perhaps for the last time in a life of firm decisions. Wolfe's voice dropped a fraction, and someone caught him hesitating. A single shot to the base of the skull, efficient, silent, and final. He allowed a breath, not a pause, a breath, so the painting would stay silent. I looked at Tamsin. Her gaze was fixed, not on Wolfe, but on some internal theatre she hadn't yet exited. Wolfe sat down, exhaling not from exhaustion, but from decision. And now the burden shifted quietly to truth's last defenders. Wolfe, from his throne of indifference, spoke the name like a verdict. Carl Fisk. The temperature in the room dropped a half-degree, enough to make Claudia glance sideways and Tamsin look nowhere. He discovered the forgery, Wolfe continued, not by diligence but by chance, a discrepancy in phrasing, a signature too eager, a witness name inverted. I remembered Fisk's smugness, the way his grin never reached his eyes. He confronted Tamsin with it, quietly, with calculation. He had no interest in justice. He saw an opportunity, the kind that lets a man whisper instead of shout. Wolfe reached for his beer. The glass remained untouched. So he squeezed her. Not for money, Tamsin has none, but for silence, a promise, an assurance that his hands would stay clean if hers did. He paused, then tapped a finger on the armrest. But when a woman's already committed one murder, asking her to trust you becomes hazardous. Carl Fisk drank a private toast that night. Scotch, yes, but the vintage had a new note in it. A subtle bitterness, cyanide, delicately stirred. Wolfe looked at Tamsin, not with contempt, but with the faintest trace of curiosity. There are things Wolfe touches only rarely. One of them is evidence. The other is anything not served on porcelain. But that night he reached into the desk drawer like a priest retrieving a relic. He held the bullet gently, turning it between thumb and forefinger, not reverently, analytically. This, he said, entered the canvas cleanly. It made no jagged tear, no splintered mess. It travelled at measured velocity and with intent, unmarred by haste. He tilted it to the light. This was not fired in fear, it was staged. I watched him hold the slug as though it contained theology. Whoever pressed the trigger for this shot wasn't killing, they were composing. It wasn't just the bullet. It was the idea of the bullet. A narrative made metallic. Wolfe set it down with finality. In the end, facts tarnish, but metal remembers. No one replied. The room had stopped pretending to breathe. I didn't blame them. Some truths don't need blood to be sharp. Claudia's eyes found Tamsin's, and for a moment the murder, the bullets, even the forged will were suspended in that gaze. It wasn't blame that passed between them. It was something worse. Recognition. She said nothing. Her silence was the kind that builds echo chambers in the heart. Tamsin, who had fired a gun and spun a story, finally cracked, not with confession, but collapse. Her hands trembled once and then stilled, resting in her lap like forgotten things. There was no protest, no apology. Wolfe, who despised emotional displays even more than drafts in winter, let the silence sit. "Treason of the heart," he murmured, "is rarely punished by law." I wanted to say something, anything, but even I couldn't dress that moment in words. They stayed there like two women at the edge of a canyon, having discovered the distance was carved by themselves. Wolfe gave me a glance that meant, let it be. And for once, I obeyed. Because sometimes silence is the only language the guilty still understand. Wolfe didn't rise this time. He merely folded his hands, looked at the people who remained, and closed the curtain on the performance. "A bullet lies," he said, "but the canvas remembers." The room didn't exhale, it released, slowly, like the end of a long-held breath. Claudia remained seated, her back unbending but no longer proud. Tamsin hadn't moved, but something about her had shrunk, perhaps her alibi, perhaps her certainty. Jasper Lynn made a soft sound, less a sob than the suggestion of one. Kramer, of course, had heard enough to justify a dozen calls downtown, but even he waited. Because there are verdicts that don't need courtrooms. Wolfe pressed his palms together. "I have nothing further," he said, "except that the truth rarely pleases anyone. That, too, is part of its price." He looked at the fire, unlit, and then at me. I knew the evening was over, but endings, like murders, often leave something behind. So I watched as the suspects stood, walked out, and carried their silence with them like debt. Later, much later, Wolfe was in the greenhouse. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His fingers moved over the orchid petals with the delicacy of someone who'd just broken something invisible and was trying to put it back. I stood at the threshold, watching him tend to beauty with a tenderness he never gave people. Maybe that's why he liked plants. They don't betray, don't whisper, don't rewrite wills. I thought about Claudia's face when the bullet was named, about Tamsin's silence, about Dempsey's last drive and Carl Fisk's final drink. Justice had shown up, but it had brought no champagne. Some murders are quick. This one had taken years to ripen. When it did, the rot was elegant, buried under oil paint and family names. Wolfe didn't glance at me, just murmured something in Latin to a yellow phalaenopsis, and I let him have it. He'd earned the silence. In the end, no one applauded, no medals were pinned, no tears cleaned anything. The guilty were named, yes, but the wounds were older than the crime and deeper than the grave. I closed the file on my desk and locked the drawer. Outside, Manhattan went on, pretending to be new, but inside that brownstone we'd seen a portrait of love, cracked by shame, varnished with silence, and framed by lies. Wolfe, true to form, returned to his beer and beef. And me? I lit a cigarette I didn't finish and muttered, "Justice didn't bring peace to anyone this time, but at least it knew how to aim." And so the final word wasn't spoken. It hung in the room like the last note of a requiem, unclaimed by voice but heard by all. A will altered in silence, a bullet aimed at reputation, and love twisted into secrecy. Wolfe returned to his orchids and I to my typewriter, but something lingered. The ache of a truth uncovered too late for comfort, too early for forgetting. Do you believe that protecting someone's name can ever justify erasing their truth? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed the mystery, be sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves detective stories, and subscribe for more. Not every case ends with applause, but the truth, once found, always echoes